and livestock to protect and conserve natural resources. We also have programs to help riparian landowners put riparian buffers in. We have a soil testing program, which we'll talk about just briefly during this presentation. And we also have a native plant sale that we hold every year. So for more information on that, we'll have our website at the end that you can learn more about our programs. But we wanted to just briefly give an introduction to what we do at the Conservation District. And we also, we are non-regulatory, so we don't do any permits, we don't do any fines. We're actually a subdivision of state government, so we aren't associated with the county at all. While we do work with the county frequently, we aren't funded entirely by the county. So it's a little bit more about us. So the topics that we're going to cover tonight in this fall pasture management presentation are just a brief overview of Pastures 101. This isn't going to be a course that talks about a whole lot about pastures, and except for the fall management piece of them. So we will probably have some more talks this coming spring that really get more heavily into kind of some pasture management techniques. But this one's going to be really tailored to fall management options. We're going to talk about the maintenance that's very important during the fall. We're going to talk a little bit about fertilization and then fall pasture innovation, and then touch on some weed prevention as well, because it's never too early to start trying to control weeds in a pasture. And I did forget to mention earlier, we are recording this presentation, and so it will be available for future viewing. So if there's anything you missed tonight during this live presentation, we will actually be emailing this recorded version out next week to everyone that's on live, and then also everyone that requested the recorded version. All right, so to jump into healthy pastures, the first thing that healthy pastures, what we want them to do is to provide feed for our animals. So a 1,000-pound animal consumes about 3 to 4 tons of forage in the 6th to 7th month grazing period. So it's about 2.5% to 3% of body weight, which can vary slightly depending on if they're, mothering cow or a horse that has a foal. But generally, that's kind of a good rule of thumb. There are some animals that it might be a little bit less than that as well, but we try to stick with that. And then also, it takes about 2 acres per 1,000-pound animal to sustain them through the grazing season. So that's definitely changes depending on if someone has really good soil versus someone who has a little bit soil that isn't quite as productive, or if someone is irrigating versus non-irrigating, they may be able to have less acres per 1,000-pound animal, but that's kind of a good rule of thumb to be at. Healthy pastures also protect water quality. The grass utilizes the nutrients from the manure, and then if there are streams or ditches or ponds, having healthy grass can protect them from erosion and runoff, and having that potential manure and the nutrients from the manure run off into waterways. So healthy pastures are not going to be overgrazed. So generally about a 3-inch stubble height is what you want to have for a pasture to stay healthy long term. When you start to get below that 3-inch stubble height, you're going to see the weeds really start to come in. It's not to say that weeds can't also be found in pastures that are very, very productive and aren't grazed below 3 inches, but you'll definitely start to see more weeds come in when your stubble height is below 3 inches. Okay, and healthy pastures also aren't typically going to be filled with large deposits of manure and a lot of bare spots. So a healthy pasture will be fairly uniformly grazed, not below 3 inches, not have too many weeds, and the manure will hopefully be drug throughout the pasture to kind of spread those nutrients around. And we're going to get into more of that later on in the presentation. So overgrazing, as I mentioned, is when we leave less than 3 inches of leaf material. So what can happen if pastures are overgrazed is it can very much slow the regrowth of the pastures, and it can damage the root system and also lead to death of the plant eventually. So you can see here on this photo here on the left-hand side that here we have a nice healthy grass plant. It's probably about 6 to 8 inches in height, which is what we like to see. And you have a good deep root system. You know, roughly the roots mirror the above ground material. So then we come along and our animals graze it down to about 3 to 4 inches, which is a great stubble height to leave behind. And our roots are still at about 3 to 4 inches. So still able to gather water and nutrients that are down in the soil that they need to grow. But if we leave our animals on too long, we end up having this particular plant that is very lowly grazed. And then you can see that the root system mirrors what is above ground there. So that root system will very much be hindered by the fact that this plant was overgrazed too much. So when we have a root system that is low like this, it's not going to be able to get the nutrients and the water that these other root systems are, and this grass plant will eventually start to die off. You'll start to see more weeds come into the pasture. You'll start to see more bare spots, and this eventually will just lead to a pasture that may need to be completely renovated. So overgrazing, it can happen in two ways, leaving stock in a pasture for too long, or also bringing them back too soon when your plant hasn't had enough rest period to grow up tall enough. So you can see here in this photo, this pasture has a lot of curly dock, which is the reddish colored plant, also has some tansy ragwort, which is the yellow plant back there and is actually poisonous to horses. And this pasture, you can definitely tell, has been very overgrazed. It probably is just grazed, you know, potentially year round and never has a chance to rest and recover. You can also see that there are some manure deposits here, most likely, or possibly urine, where the grass is a lot greener, and the horses probably aren't grazing here quite as much since they don't really like to graze where they've gone to the bathroom. And so these areas are maybe allowed to grow up just a little bit more and are also probably benefiting from the extra nutrients that are coming out the back end of the horse and being put there. But you can see, you know, that this pasture is just not in good shape, and it's just going to keep getting more and more weeds and producing less and less grass. So this is what we try not to see in a pasture. So the golden rule of grazing, which I've touched on quite a bit, is don't graze lower than 3 inches. If at all possible, try not to ever graze lower than 3 inches. And then when you put your animals back on to regraze, you really want to try to have that grass be at least 6 to 8 inches in height. That way your root system, as I talked about earlier, can start to mirror that 6 to 8 inches that you have above ground and be able to get down and get the moisture and all of that you want to make sure that it can get the nutrients as well. During the growing season, this can take anywhere from 4 to 5 weeks. So you really want to allow for that, you know, either by having a pasture that's kind of a quote sacrifice pasture that you can put them in, and you know that that area will get overgrazed, but you don't mind that small area being overgrazed as long as the rest of your pastures can continue to grow up and stay healthy. Or some people have a paddock off of their barn that they put animals in until the pasture's grown back up. Or you can also do a rotational grazing system, which we'll touch on very briefly as well. But all of these, you know, just bottom line here is that you want to not graze lower than 3 inches, pull your animals off if it starts to get lower than 3 inches, and then don't put them back on until the grass plants are about 6 to 8 inches tall. Okay, and so again, basically what we want to do here is we want to take half of what's there and leave half, and that's going to give us the most healthy root systems. So here on this chart, if we remove 50% of the volume of leaf, then only about 2 to 4% of the root growth will stop. Whereas if we get down here and remove about 70% of the volume of leaf that we have, about 78% of the root growth will stop. When we get into this 80 or 90% and we're getting into very, very overgrazed pastures, that's when we'll start to have root growth completely stopped and really start to see death of these grass plants. And some species are much better grazers than others. So for instance, horses with their top and bottom teeth, and sheep as well, they both are able to get down very low to the ground and graze. Sheep have the split lip, so they're able to kind of maneuver their lips and get down really deep, and both of those species will tend to overgraze pastures worse than cattle. Since cattle don't have top teeth and they have to wrap their tongue around grass, they tend to be a little bit easier on pastures and not overgraze them quite to the point that horses and sheep can. So I thought I'd just throw that in a little bit since those who have horses and sheep need to be just a little bit more aware that overgrazing can happen a lot worse sometimes than it can with cattle herds. So we're not going to really touch on rotational grazing right now, but I did just want to show a slide to reflect what I meant when I mentioned rotational grazing. And so what this is taking and dividing large pastures into smaller pastures and then rotating your animals throughout these smaller pastures during the grazing season. So this picture on the right is what we really try to push folks to have: a barn and then a confinement area around the barn that's ideally gravel so that it's a mud-free area. And we did just give a presentation last week on creating mud-free paddocks. So if you want more information on that, get in touch with us and we can email that recorded viewing out to you. So you have your confinement area, and then in this particular one, they took what was a big pasture and they divided it up into 4 different pastures. So that way they can rotate through these to try to make sure that their plants are always at a minimum of 3 inches. And the great part about this is having this confinement area, if none of their pastures are back up to that 6 to 8 inch level, they can put the animals back into this confinement area and close them off from all the pastures until there's a pasture that is ready to graze. Not all pastures will be ready in the same rate, so it's not to say that this particular pasture will be ready in 6 weeks and so will this one and so will this one. It really depends. Sometimes you'll have some water down deep that plants can get, so you might have one area of your pasture that's wetter later in the summer, one that's drier. So that's kind of the beauty about creating the rotational grazing system, is you can really work with your land to try to capture your pastures at their best times and utilize as much forage as you can, kind of based on the differences in your land. So stay tuned. We will actually be holding a rotational grazing workshop. I don't know if it'll be a webinar, if we'll be able to be back in person by spring 2021, but we are planning for a workshop then on this topic. All right, so to get into a little bit about how grass grows, in our area, typically the growing season is going to be about April to October. We do start to see grass growing in March as the temperatures get warmer and the days get longer. But for the most part, our peak is really going to hit in the April and May timeframe and then start to kind of taper off a little bit. Still some growth in June. And then once all the grass plants head out in June, usually sometimes we have Timothy coming in a little bit later, like the end of June with its seed head. But once that happens, the plants generally say, we've reproduced for the year. We're not going to keep really trying to grow. And it kind of corresponds with the fact we don't have a lot of moisture coming in starting about the beginning of July through till about the beginning of September. So the plants really just slow down and they start to go dormant right around about November. So we'll get sometimes a little bit more of a green up in September as we start to get some of our rains, but for the most part, we're going to get that big growth flush in April to June, and then it just sort of tapers off, and then they go pretty much completely dormant November to March, so they're not going to have really much of any growth. And this dormancy period is very key to be careful with the plants during that time, since they're sleeping. We don't want to do a whole lot with them during that time. And we'll talk about that a little bit more here. So the reason that fall is so crucial for pasture health is because this is a time when they are really starting to regenerate their roots. So basically, the management decisions that we're going to make in the fall are going to affect how plants are able to overwinter. And then they're also going to determine how much new growth we have coming on in the spring and how much total forage will even be produced during the entire next season. So if we overgraze them during this particular time, it can really inhibit how much we're going to see the next spring. So in the fall, they are regenerating these roots that they oftentimes kind of slump off during the late summer when they're not getting as much moisture. And so they need to be able to have enough energy to be able to create all these new roots. And grass plants actually store their carbohydrates in pretty much the lowest 3 inches of the plant. So these lower stems, or it can also be called the crown, rather than the roots, are really where this major storage of the complex carbohydrates are. And this sugar is very, very crucial for being able to regenerate these roots, and then also for being able to grow again next spring. So they need to have that reserve. And if we overgraze our pastures in the fall and we graze lower than 3 inches, a lot of those stored carbohydrates can be eaten and basically taken away. And that means that the grass plant may be set back in growth for this next spring. It might be damaged so much that it might not even be able to grow that well next spring. So we really want to make sure that we're protecting them this time of year above all. And fall is also very crucial because it's when they start to establish all of their growing points that'll be very important for next spring. So basically these little grass, these growing points, they're like little tillers or little grass shoots. They're sort of like babies in that they need a steady supply of nutrients, and they also need to be protected from stress. So if we overgraze them, we can tend to damage these little grass shoots or tillers, and they're not going to be able to get all these nutrients that they need to be able to keep growing, which then will cause your spring grass not to be able to come on very quickly. So again, it's very, very important not to overgraze them. And there's also some older tillers that we have that may be even dormant brown. You might think that's actually dead grass, but a lot of times those, that dead looking grass can actually be storage, and that can actually have some storage in there, some energy that then these new tillers, these new growing points can utilize to be able to grow next spring. And the older tillers can also provide physical protection to these new little tillers. So again, it's really crucial to try not to overgraze your pastures in order to be able to have healthy pastures for next spring. All right, so the other thing that's very important to do during the fall is to start thinking about how you can remove your animals from the pastures in the wintertime. To have the best pastures possible, you really need to make sure that you don't have animals out there grazing and trampling them all throughout the winter, because the plants, once they go dormant, it's just very hard for them to survive that kind of activity. They'll also compact the wet soils, which can lead to a lot less pore space. And that pore space is what can help retain water and keep these plants growing later into the summer. So if we compact our soils and get rid of those pore spaces, our grass plants can become dehydrated isn't the right word, but in essence, dehydrated sooner in the summer and not able to keep growing as late into the summer. And as you can see here, the hooves act a lot like plungers, especially with horses, since they have just the one solid hoof versus sheep or goats or cattle with their split hoof. And so really, they make a huge mess. They make the land very uneven, and they can really ruin pastures, especially the areas where they might go up and down or where they get fed. So ideally, if you can remove animals from pastures, that's really, really a key piece of having healthy pastures. A gravel mud-free pen is an excellent choice for animals like horses and sheep and goats. We typically recommend a 5/8 minus gravel, and that way manure can be picked up very easily with the tines of a pitchfork, and the gravel will fall through and the manure will stay in the pitchfork. However, for cattle, that doesn't work quite as well. They can be kept on gravel, especially if it's topped with hog fuel, but their manure is really hard to remove on that gravel. So typically for cattle, it's better to have a concrete feeding area and possibly a sacrifice pasture, which is one that you're not is worried about grass growth. It's mainly just kind of a an area that you would keep that the cattle could go out on in the winter time, and there's going to be some mud, there's going to be some bare spots, but then you can reseed that in the springtime and have that kind of rested throughout the summer so that they can go back in there in the winter time. And this is just kind of a couple of examples of cattle. These ones right here are on a concrete slab, so they're getting fed on there. They probably have a sacrifice pasture adjacent to this that they can get out in, so that they have a place to lie down that isn't going to be on concrete. And then this one here, they are feeding out in the middle of a sacrifice pasture here, and it looks like they may at one time have kind of made a mound of hog fuel out there, just to kind of keep them up a little bit higher and drier out of so they're a little bit off of the wet pastures. So now we're going to talk just a little bit about fall pasture maintenance. So some of the things that we want to do this time of year are to monitor the height of our grass plants, to mow, to drag, take soil tests if we can get out there and get them, and do a little bit of fertilization, and then reseed if needed, and do some weed control also if needed. So we want to monitor to make sure our grass height isn't below 3 inches, which I've talked a lot about. So that's kind of the first thing, is to go out there right now and look and make sure that your grass isn't getting grazed below 3 inches. If it is, pull your animals off if you're able to, and then let your pastures just sit and rest until next spring. This mowing is actually a great technique in the fall if you have pastures that might have an area that has been grazed down low, but other areas that animals haven't touched. It might have got kind of stemmy. There might be some weeds out there. So basically it's really great to just kind of mow it all down, get it all about at the same level, just so it's nice and uniform and all at sort of the same point for next spring to start growing all kind of at the same height. So you want to mow no lower than about 4 to 5 inches, just to make sure that you're keeping that great leaf height there for reserve of carbohydrates. And this can also kind of help encourage a little bit of new grass growth, and it can make grass more palatable for next season as well. So dragging is really great this time of year too. It will break up clumps of manure, and it will also help spread out those nutrients that are in the manure. And so by doing this, by mowing and then also by dragging, both of these techniques together can really help allow for a lot more even regrowth. This time of year, a lot of times we'll look at horse pastures especially. And help get the nutrients all spread out. So now we're going to talk a little bit about fertility and some of the things that we see when we look out on a pasture, and we can just tell right away that this is a low fertility pasture, are bright green grass spots around manure piles, short, wispy, unproductive species of grass, and then also high amounts of moss and weeds. All three of these are indicators of a pasture that is probably fairly low in fertility and might need some nutrients in order to help grass be as healthy as possible. So for instance, this pasture, we can see out here that while this is a fairly green and good looking pasture that doesn't look like it's had a lot of overgrazing, maybe a couple spots have been overgrazed, you can see that there are some obvious piles out here where manure, possibly urine, has been deposited, and those nutrients led to this pasture being healthier. So what's interesting is you can see that if this whole pasture had the nutrients that it needed to grow, that it could all look as nice and healthy as some of these spots out and about there. So this is a great indicator that this person could be producing a lot more forage if they had their fertility at the proper place. And then this is another thing that we would see in a low fertility pasture, basically just a pasture full of buttercup. You know, the weeds have taken over because they can grow with this lower fertility soil, whereas the grass plants have a tougher time with it. So fall is actually a great time to take a soil test. It gives you a lot of time throughout the winter to be able to plan out what fertility needs that your soils are going to need for next spring. And we do actually have a low-cost soil testing program through the Conservation District. Unfortunately, right now, due to COVID-19, our staff are primarily working from home, so we're not actually taking those soil samples in our office right now. However, we have detailed instructions on how to submit tests to the same lab that we utilize, and those instructions can be found on our website at this link right here, this clallamcd.org/soil-testing. And if you go to our main clallamcd.org website, you can find a link to that as well. And then if you do go ahead and send in a soil test, please reach out to us, and we're very happy to help you interpret that soil test so that you understand you know, what would be the best timing of fertilizer applications and how to figure out what exactly that they're telling you you do need to apply out there. And so to collect a soil test, what you want to do is you want to remove all of the thatch or organic matter or anything like that that is on your soil and get down to the bare mineral soil. And you're going to want to take a sample. You can either use a soil probe, which we do have those for loan in our office, and we can loan those out if you call ahead to make an appointment. And you can also use a shovel though and take a slice of the earth like this, and then you want to take a narrow slice out of that triangle that you would have gotten with a shovel so that you can get a nice profile of your soil, a nice even profile. And you want to take about 10 to 15 of these small little subsamples throughout your pastures, can be seen in this photo here. And then of those 10 to 15 little subsamples that you take, you want to mix those all together very well in a bucket. And the soil is going to need about 3 cups. I'm sorry, the soil testing lab is going to need about 2 to 3 cups of soil. It's best to have more than less, so just make sure that you have as much as they're asking for on their website. But we usually tell people about 3 cups to make sure you have plenty. So this is what a soil test will look like when you get it back. I just wanted to throw this up here. I'm not going to cover this in depth, but I did just want to show you that it will give you the pH, which is very important because that will indicate whether you need to apply dolomite or lime, both of which will help raise up the pH of your soil to where grass wants it to be. Generally in our area, soils are going to be a little bit acidic because of our rainfall, and grass plants like slightly acidic soil at about 6 to 6.5, but 5.5 here, this pH is a little bit lower than what grass plants would like to grow in. And so in this particular test, they're recommending that 7,000 pounds per acre of lime be applied. They also are recommending some nitrogen, some phosphorus, some potash, and a little bit of sulfur. So this test is very common for what we'll find in our area of pastures that haven't been heavily fertilized, possibly used to be forested soils as well, way back many years ago. And so this would be a very typical test. But getting a soil test is great because it can really help you dial in what you need so you're not purchasing any amendments that you might not have needed. So if you fertilize according to the soil test, you can definitely get healthier grass, you can get fewer weeds, and you can get less moss. And I really like to put this photo in here because this was of a lady who has a hay field, and she got a soil test and she applied to the soil test, and she really wanted to get rid of oxeye daisies. So after several years of applying to her soil test, mowing at the proper time to try to help get the daisies out of the system, she was able to get her pastures, or her fields, the one over here on the right hand side, she was able to get the daisies pretty much eradicated from her system, whereas this field over here, they're still out there. So the dividing property line, I believe, just kind of goes right along here where you can see there are no daisies on one side and there are daisies on the other side. Oops, my apologies, I clicked ahead. So commercial fertilizers, you want to only apply them during the growing seasons. So you wouldn't want to apply them in the winter time. Fall, you can apply just a little bit. I wouldn't apply a whole bunch, especially of nitrogen, because that can actually leach out with high rainfall. But spring is when you really want to start thinking about applying fertilizer, because that's when grass is actively growing and can take a lot of nutrients up and need those nutrients to get that active growth that it does from April to June. The other thing, you don't want to apply fertilizer if you already have overgrazed pastures. That isn't going to do a whole lot because what can happen, especially with nitrogen, is it can leach into the soil. And if your roots are not very deep because your grass plants aren't very tall, then it can actually just leach right out of your soil and you can lose all that money that you put down in fertilizer. So you want to have at least a 3-inch stubble height of grass when you apply fertilizer to make sure that you're not going to be leaching out that fertilizer. So if you can't perform a soil test, kind of a rule of thumb that we've used, that I believe it was WSU kind of developed this, is to apply about 80 pounds of phosphorus and potassium and 40 pounds of nitrogen per acre per year. And generally, you're going to want to split this into 2 applications. You would want to do one in the early spring and then one in the early fall before the heavy rains. So right now, if you wanted to do a fertilizer application and you didn't have results from a soil test, this rule of thumb here is what you could use to put out there. Again, soil test is really great to have because you don't want to be putting things down that you don't necessarily need, but in the absence of one, this is the recommendation that has been given by Washington State University Extension. And so when you read a fertilizer bag, it will generally have 3 numbers, possibly 4 on it. Ratio here. And so the first number will be how much nitrogen is in the bag. The second one will be how much phosphorus or available phosphate is in the bag. And then the third number is going to be the soluble potash or potassium, we call it, that will be available to put out there for the plants. So for instance, 5, 10, 15, that means 5% of this bag has nitrogen or is nitrogen, 10% is the phosphate, and then 15% is this potash. So then there's a lot of filler material to help put it on properly. So this particular one, you'd have to do a little bit of math to figure out if it was going to meet these rule of thumb numbers. But we're available to help you with that if you have a bag of fertilizer and you're not quite sure how to put that out there. So really all the bags of fertilizer are going to vary in what they have, and you want to just get one that's most closely matched to what you're trying to put out there and how many pounds per acre you're trying to put out there. So as I mentioned, lime raises the pH of soils and it helps make them less acidic. So around a 6 is about optimum, even up to 6.5 pH for grass plants works just fine. And you want to apply at about a rate of 1 to 2 tons per acre per year if you don't have a soil test. The great thing about lime, though, is once you put it down, it sticks with your soil. It moves very, very slowly through the soil profile. So if someone is to apply all the lime that they need to over a several-year period, they probably wouldn't have to do it again for many, many years, maybe even a decade or 2. It really moves very slowly through. So that's the great part about lime, is it will stay in that soil. And fall is an excellent time of year to apply lime because then we can use the rains that we have during the wintertime to help incorporate them into the soil since it moves so slowly through that soil profile. All right, that part concludes my portion of this presentation. Jennifer is going to hop in for the next portion, but I am going to pause here while she gets ready and ask if there's any questions. So Jennifer, were there any? Actually, I think I can pull up the chat box. No, it doesn't look like we have any questions. Okay, so Jennifer, are you able to hop in with your presentation?
Yep, just a minute here and I will get that started.
All right. Uh-oh, I am sorry. Let me see if I can share that. I can't share the screen back to you.
Okay, let's see. I have the screen. Let's see here. One moment, and we should be on our way. Okay.
Oh, it looks like we did actually have a question pop up.
Perfect.
Okay, is there a local place to rent a field harrow or equivalent to a drag, a pasture drag? Gosh, I am not aware of one. Do you know of any, Jen?
Um, no. The only place you could check with is the rental place in Squim, but they typically don't rent out farm equipment. So I'm not sure. We will talk a little bit about options for making your own harrow. If you've got an old piece of chain link fencing that you can weight down, that will help. Or no climb fencing kind of weighted down on either end will help as well. You can pull that behind a tractor or an ATV.
And then we had another question. Can lime be spread using a lawn seeder for a small area, like an orchard? So yes, the prilled lime, it can be. It's kind of more, it comes out more like fertilizer would and that like smaller round pellets. That kind can be spread using a lawn seeder. The kind that is the powdered lime, that's going to be a lot harder to spread with a lawn seeder. So generally, I do just recommend that people buy the prilled lime, since it actually is pretty easy to spread. Whereas the powder, a lot of times if it's windy or there's any moisture, it'll clump up in the spreader if there's moisture, and if it's windy, sometimes I've seen people who part of their lime application ended up at the neighbors. So that powdered stuff's pretty hard to utilize.
Any other questions before we get started?
Uh-oh, someone said we've lost audio. Oh shoot, I don't know. Um,
Okay. Let's see. And
I can,
are you able to
okay.
see my screen too, Megan?
Yes, I can see it says questions on it. So I think if you just hit slideshow, maybe we'll hopefully be in business.
There we go.
Perfect.
Okay.
All right.
And then let's see. Let's try to make sure we've got the audio before we go much further.
Oh, I
Um,
think we got it back. Oh no, he said he still can't hear anything. Uh-oh. Let's see here. Um, let's see. Have you checked your computer audio to see if that might be? Because I'm not sure. I don't think we have anybody else that's having any problems like that. Maybe try logging out and then locking back in to the participant that's having trouble. There's at the bottom there's a leave button that kind of has a phone headset on it. And if you hit leave and then maybe click to come back in, maybe the audio will come back. Because it seems to be that you're the only person having that trouble. I don't think anyone else is having any trouble with that. Okay, so I have one last question here before we jump to this next section. Can you put your horse back on the pasture after liming? You can, but I generally myself try to wait for at least one rainstorm to help incorporate that in. If you are putting it on pastures that are pretty low, the risk would be greater, in my opinion, because then the horse will be grazing closer to where that lime material is. Whereas if you have pretty tall pastures and you're using the prilled lime, which is heavy, so it's going to kind of fall down a lot closer to the soil surface, I think your risk would be less than if you were using a powdered lime and it really coated the blades of grass, and then you had it right there where your horses might be grazing it. That said, I have never heard of anyone saying that they've had any intoxication with lime and their animals getting into it. But just for me, I like to play it a little bit safe and wait until a good rainstorm to make sure that there's not going to be anything they'd be ingesting. Okay, so Jen, I think you're ready to take it over then.
Sure. All right. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and move into the presentation, and Like Megan said earlier, my name is Jennifer, and I'm a planner here at Clallam Conservation District. And both Megan and I also have livestock and grew up on farms. And I currently own a 24-acre farm, and I have kept a variety of grazing livestock: horses, cattle, goats, sheep. I think I've kept everything but an alpaca or a llama. So I'm going to talk to you just a bit more this evening about when to renovate and replant pastures. And so this is a question Megan and I get a lot of questions about. We have a lot of folks that are new to the area. Some of those people are converting former forest land and building homes and barns and trying to establish pasture. So obviously, if you're in that group, you are going to need to plant a pasture. A lot of times people are buying property. There's a lot of pasture and old pasture across our county. And a lot of times, pastures kind of have a shelf life. And if it's been, 20, 30 years since there's really been a lot of TLC given to that field, that could be a good candidate for some renovation and replanting. Also, if you have a significant weed infestation, so you look out across the pasture and you see more weeds than grass, then that could be a situation where we want to look at replanting or renovating. And then also I'll talk a bit, Megan mentioned earlier, sacrifice pastures, which are just basically pastures that you're confining animals in. The goal is just to give the animals some space, whether it's to keep them off the rest of the fields. And those pastures do need to be replanted, especially this time of year. On my farm, I use a sacrifice pasture for my horses. Just as they get too much grass, I'll kind of throw them in a sacrifice pasture, but I always replant that pasture in the fall. So fall is a great time for doing pasture renovation and reseeding and planting. However, do not be tempted to renovate all of your pastures at once. As you're going to learn during this talk, there's a lot of money, time, and a bit of risk that goes into renovating pastures. And those are baby pastures. And so just like infants and baby livestock, they need extra time and care. So if you renovate all your fields, then you're going to kind of be in a situation next grazing season where you may not have any pasture to actually graze your livestock. Now is a great time to replant. Grass seed, just like any other plant you plant in your garden, needs water. It needs either rain, or if you have irrigation water. So timing it, like Megan mentioned with the lime application, timing your pasture planting with some fall rains, excellent plan. If you wait too late and you plant your grass later October timeframe, sometimes if we have an early hard frost, which has actually happened the last few years, you run the risk of damaging those pasture seedlings to frost and frost damage. So renovating pastures. Bare ground in the summer is basically going to turn into mud during the winter, like Megan mentioned. And then what's going to grow in that bare spot is likely not going to be grass. It's typically going to be weeds, because weeds are opportunists. They germinate very quickly. And so by kind of leaving these areas barren into the winter, you're running the risk of inviting a lot of weeds onto your property. So the basic steps for renovating pasture is you want to select some grass seed that is suited to your site. And we're going to talk about a bunch more about this. You're going to need to kill the existing vegetation. So if this is a situation where there's already something out there, say it's just a lot of weeds and you don't want that, or it's a less than desirable grass type, you have to get rid of that vegetation. You're going to need to create a firm seed bed. You're going to apply seed to a depth of 1/4 inch. Then we recommend harrow or dragging the soil. And then keep an eye on weeds. And lastly, you're going to use a pole test before you begin grazing next spring. So don't worry, I know that's a lot of information, but we're going to dive a little bit more into exactly what all of that means. So when you're renovating your pastures and you're trying to figure out what grasses you should plant, you're going to need to think about the sort of animals you're grazing, what sort of soil you have, and honestly, just the amount of time that you want to invest into managing your pastures. Some grass species, as we'll talk about, do not handle overgrazing, whereas there's other grass species that you can overgraze a little bit and not have them completely disappear from your pasture system. We're going to talk about the seed mixes that are available and what stores you can find those seed mixes at here locally. So the first thing I always tell folks is think about, is this a temporary or permanent pasture? Is this going to be a sacrifice pasture that you're just trying to get some ground cover on going into the winter so you're not dealing with a lot of erosion and mud issues and controlling weeds? So in that situation, you'd want to choose something that's going to germinate very quickly, like annual ryegrass, which is also, as you'll learn later, a more affordable grass species. Or are you planting a more permanent pasture that you plan to actually roll up your sleeves and do some active management on? And if so, you're going to want to choose a perennial pasture mix. So perennial means it's going to persist long term and not be just a one-shot sort of deal like an annual ryegrass. As you'll learn, those are more expensive as far as seed sources and take a little longer to germinate, but they're also typically more productive. So let's dive a little bit more into the common grass species that Megan and I typically recommend. And so orchard grass is one that's very common throughout our county. It's a good quality grass. It regrows well. It will grow in some shade, under some shade. It's very nutritious. It's very palatable. The animals really like it. It also makes a great hay. It is one that doesn't do real well to being continually grazed, especially if you hit it hard right now. This time of year, its growth points are a little bit higher. So if you allow your livestock and horses to overgraze orchard grass, it will suffer and you'll see less and less of it out in your pasture. And it doesn't really like super saturated soils. It wants a more well-drained soil. It's pretty hardy, but if there's a lot of water on the pasture, it won't stick around. So the other forage species we recommend is perennial ryegrass. This is a very, again, palatable, very nutritious plant. It's very easy, like the annual ryegrass, to get started. And it does hold up a little bit better to close grazing. We're, of course, not promoting overgrazing, but this is one, if you get a little lazy or you're just not paying attention with your stubble height, this is one that can handle it a bit better. It does not do well on shaded pastures. So if you've got a lot of overcover and trees, it's not going to be super happy there. It likes a more well-drained soil. And the other thing I don't have on this slide, but I should mention, is that it does require a good deal of soil fertility. So if you haven't or don't plan to actively manage your soil fertility through soil testing and fertilizing, then this might not be a good choice for you. It doesn't really do great in a super low nitrogen setting, which a lot of our soils just are naturally low in nitrogen. So might not be a good choice if you're not going to actively manage your soil fertility and fertilize. And then the next one, these are kind of the top three. The third one is tall fescue. And so again, this is a good quality plant. It's very tough. It can be stimulated and spread through frequent grazing, grows well in the fall once you get some fall rains. And it does well in both poorly drained soils and well-drained soils. Disadvantage is there is an endophyte on the old seed varieties, which is I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but what I will say is that whenever you purchase seed, and almost all seed is endophyte free, and that endophyte means there's not a fungus associated with this particular type of fescue. And if it is there, that can cause problems in breeding mares. So if you're running a breeding operation, you definitely want to ensure that you have endophyte-free fescue. I'd say the other disadvantage of this particular plant is if it gets ahead of you, if it grows faster than your livestock can graze it, it can get kind of tough and not very palatable as it matures. So it's better, this is a better grass to kind of actively, put your animals or your mower out there when it's 6 to 8 inches, and don't let it kind of get ahead of you over the 10 to 12 inch 14 inches and on. It's a very tall plant, but it gets kind of stemmy and a little bit tough and rough as it matures. So another grass that you hear a lot about is Timothy. And again, this is a very high quality grass. It's easy to establish. It does do well in poorly drained soils. However, we do not recommend this as a pasture grass simply because it just cannot hold up to grazing pressure. So I have really never seen Timothy persist in any, especially horse pastures. It's very sweet. The animals love it. They will target it. And if you overgraze it, it just will not regrow. So it's more a plant that we recommend for hay fields rather than actual pastures. So legumes, healthy pastures are diverse pastures. They're not just monocultures. So we typically recommend the orchard grass, tall fescue, and perennial ryegrass. Plus, we like to have some legumes in that mix as well. Legumes are great because they fix nitrogen from the air. And as I mentioned, our soils are naturally deficient in nitrogen. And so this will kind of help build up soil fertility. It's nutritious, and it can be more productive in the summer sometimes than grasses. So white clover is something, which that bumblebee is sitting on, is something that is just occurs naturally, and it holds up really well to overgrazing. So a lot of the overgrazed pastures that Megan and I walk through, there'll be a lot of white clover. So it's typically not something that you need to add into your pasture. It's probably already there. There's probably a red clover or a white clover out there. But if you, put your boots on and go walk out through the field and you don't see a legume in there, then that would be something I'd consider adding into your pasture. Another plant that we really love is bird's foot trefoil. Again, it's very nutritious. It does well in a variety of soil conditions, especially including wet soils. We see this a lot kind of in Port Angeles and West area. You can graze this, not overgraze it, but certainly graze it. It's a little slow to get established, but once it is growing and it's healthy and you take care of it, it can last very long term in pastures. I've seen pastures where there's definitely trefoil growing that was planted at least 50 years ago. So it's a pretty cool plant as well. Red clover, again, just good quality, easy to establish. It's not going to do well in really wet soils, and it just is one that if you want red clover in your field, you're going to have to kind of replant it every 5 years at least or so. It's not one that I recommend in hay fields. It's a little bit hard to dry. I've only seen a few farmers successfully be able to get it dry enough to bale it so it doesn't cause molding issues. So not a good choice if you're using a pasture also as a hay field. And I already talked briefly about white clover. Again, it's probably out in a pasture system already, but if not, it is a good one to plant. It's not a terribly big plant, so there's not a lot like per mouthful. And any of these clovers can, if there's a lot of them, cause bloat, which can be a problem in some of the ruminant livestock. Okay, so the next thing I kind of want to talk about are just general seed cost estimates. And we'll talk a little bit more about how much of this you need later in the presentation. But I just wanted to throw some ballpark cost estimates. I called around to several of the local feed stores this morning just to get some ballpark price ranges. And kind of my goal with showing you this slide is that this is replanting a pasture is an expensive, labor-intensive undertaking. In fact, it's very rare that I go out and tell someone, hey, you need to start totally over. Usually what I tell someone is, okay, you've got some of these good grasses. I see a few orchard grass. I see some ryegrass, but start applying those practices that Megan talked about. Get a soil test. Fix your soil fertility problem. Try rotational grazing. Try to keep your animals off of it in the winter. And then if you're still not satisfied with how things look, well, then go ahead and go through the effort of getting some seed in there. So you can see the 50-pound bag of orchard grass is going to run you about the $200 range. I will mention that when I talked to a couple of the local feed stores this morning, a lot of our seed, our grass seed, is grown in Oregon, the kind of central West Oregon. And so right now they're dealing with a lot of wildfires and a lot of smoke problems, and that the feed stores did say that they're having problems sourcing seed. They should be harvesting now, and the smoky conditions and fire are kind of making it a little bit more difficult. But you can buy mono bags of seeds, so not the pre-mix. So you can get orchard grass, tall fescue, perennial ryegrass. A lot of times it's overwhelming with the different varieties of orchard grass and fescue and ryegrass. They'll be early blooming, late maturing. So try not to be overwhelmed. If you stick to stuff that's more designed for the Northwest, you're going to be better off. I'll just note out there that the 50-pound bag of annual ryegrass, you can see that's pretty inexpensive compared to the perennial ryegrasses. Don't be tempted to use that for a perennial pasture, though. It's great for just getting some quick ground cover. It's great for reseeding that sacrifice pasture or that bare spot going into the winter, but it is just an annual grass, so it's not going to come back year after year. You're going to need to replant that. And then there are also pre-mixed pasture seeds. There's a lot of different brands, 5-star and 7-star. A lot of these are specific to livestock species, which we would rather see you pick grass seed specific for your growing conditions and your soil type rather than your livestock. And these ones tend to be a little bit more expensive. Sometimes you can get a bit of a price break if you go with a larger bag, like a 50-pound bag. But we try to encourage folks to really pick the grasses that we're recommending. A lot of these pre-mixed pasture seeds, you're going to pay a premium for things like Timothy, which, as you just learned in a previous slide, is really not going to stick around anyway. So a lot of times you're better off buying these single species and mixing the seed yourself. So in these steps, if you're not starting with a newly cleared forest land and you're just trying to plant a new field, you kind of have this option between overseeding and a complete reseeding. Regardless of what you're doing, just like any seed or any plant that you plant, you have to have seed to soil contact. So you can't just go out into your kind of crummy pasture and throw out some seed and expect something to take hold and germinate. You're basically just feeding the birds in that situation. So you need to do something to get rid of that existing vegetation. So you can till, you can spray, you can use a combination of both those methods. I've successfully used kind of overgrazing, like running my pastured pork through an area, letting the pigs kind of clear an area out, and then harrowing it and replanting it. So there's lots of different options here. So this is just an example of some different options, but you need to have exposed soil before you go through the effort and spend the time and money to actually plant the grass. If you're overseeding, you want to use like that bottom blue, that's a chain harrow flipped over, so the teeth are down. So something that's going to kind of scratch the surface and open up some pockets of soil. Obviously, in an overseeding situation, you're leaving some existing vegetation out there, but you still need to open up the ground for the new soil or for the new grass seed that you're trying to grow. So creating a firm seed bed, this is a real key part of it. You should be able to walk across a properly prepared seed bed and just leave light footprints. If you're sinking and it's fluffy and you don't see the tops of your boots anymore, that's too loose and fluffy, and those grass, that's just going to dry out and you're not going to really get good germination. So you can use a roller. I do think you can rent that from the rental store. I've seen those before, but anything, drive on it, anything you can do to help kind of pack that seed bed. So it's a firm seed bed that leaves like light footprints when you walk across it. So how much seed do you use when you're doing this? Well, it does kind of depend on if you're overseeding versus starting a very new pasture or completely reseeding a pasture. There's a guide that we will email to all of you that is specific on renovating pastures and hay fields in the Northwest. And on that guide, there is a table that will kind of walk you through the different factors that kind of come into determining how much seed to put out. But basically, the amount of seed that you use is going to depend on the soil type, how properly prepared the seed bed is, the type of grass you're actually trying to plant, and then what you're planning to graze it with. So this is not probably terribly clear, but you can see this guide is going to kind of help you go through, look at the type of soil you have, talk about what your plan is, if you're going to use it only for grazing, if you want to use it for grazing and hay, or for example, if it's just for kind of an exercise turnout area, there's going to be different recommendations. So you will all get copies of this. And then also included in this same publication is a seeding rate calculator where you can kind of go through, pick those species, and I would stick to those ones that we recommended, and then pick your scenario. Do you have a well-prepared tilled seed bed? Is it, kind of rough and there's not a lot of tillage out there? So that will kind of determine the rate of seeding, which basically is going to work out to how many pounds of seed of each of these types of species you're going to need to plant per acre. Just kind of in general to give you an idea, a new pasture, so if you're going like completely bare ground, it's going to need around 25 pounds of live seed per acre. And that would be if you're just like hand broadcasting it or surface broadcasting it. We'll talk a little bit more later about how to seed. If you're overseeding, so you're just trying to incorporate some different grass species or plant species into an existing pasture, the rate's going to vary, again, depending on your conditions, but you're going to want to put out probably about 10 pounds of live seed per acre. So you've picked out your seed, you've figured out how much you need, and now you're ready to actually go out and plant it. So you're going to check the forecast. You're going to try to time this with a rain event. However, you want to not time it with a significant storm event, in which case, you're having high rainfall amounts that's actually going to cause the soil and seed to kind of wash away if you're on a slope. You want to avoid seeding too deep. It's better to just hand broadcast on the surface rather than like bury the seed. There's some different equipment that you can use that we'll talk about next. And sometimes, I forgot to ask the co-op actually when I called earlier, but I know Clallam Co-op is one store that sometimes has had equipment available to like check out or loan. Ask the feed stores and see what they might have that you can actually borrow to use out on the new pasture. So the next couple slides talk a bit about equipment that you can use. And so assuming that this is like a small operation and you don't have a tractor, maybe you just have a small riding mower or you have a quad or an ATV, there's some different options. So even just the drop spreaders that you would use to replant or fertilize your lawn, those work great. I've used those to replant pastures. I don't need a gym membership. A lot of this is just kill two birds with one stone. So if you don't mind, going out and getting some boots on the ground, that's a good option. There are some pull behind options available here locally as well. And those are pretty inexpensive as well. So if you wanted to get something to hook up behind a quad or a lawnmower, a shoulder bag, those should be available at the local feed stores too. And all of these will have an option where you can set the seeding rate, which will help you kind of control how much seed you're applying. And then also to, keep track of if you're using a 50-pound bag of seed, and you kind of divide it up, and I'll say, okay, I just loaded, about 10 pounds in my spreader just to kind of help me gauge how much seed I'm actually applying. And then the cone spreader is a nice option too that you can do it. Again, that's ground driven. You can just pull that behind a quad or an ATV. If you're more large scale or you have access to a tractor or have a tractor, there's seed drills. There's more larger scale drop spreaders where you're going to be covering more ground and able to, load several bags of seed into that sort of piece of equipment. And then also there's PTO driven cone spreaders as well for use behind a tractor. And I also just threw a manure spreader on here too, just to remind me to talk to you guys about, if you have livestock and you're collecting manure, Getting that manure back out onto the pastures is another great way to boost your soil fertility and organic matter in your soil, and just should be kind of a part of your operation. You're having your animals confined in some sort of confinement area during the winter, collecting manure, and then applying that manure back out to your pastures during the spring and summer months. So that's a I believe that's a Mill Creek spreader. That's a 28 cubic foot. I do know that there are smaller. I talked with someone at Leitz's this morning, and they have a 12 cubic foot spreader. I haven't had a chance to go down and look at that, but again, it was designed for more of a small hobby farm sort of operation and can be pulled behind an ATV or a lawnmower or something like that. So you've got your seed broadcast out, and now you're ready to cover it. Again, I mentioned earlier, it's better to not do anything than to bury that seed. The easiest thing to do to provide a little bit of coverage on that seed is to just pull a drag or a harrow. We had a question earlier about, well, where can you rent one of these? And I can't really think of anything, but you can. I've seen people use old bed springs as harrows, or an old piece of chain link fencing weighted down with T-post or concrete blocks, or even just an old piece of no climb fencing, again weighted down. All those things can be used to kind of be dragged behind a pickup truck or an ATV to help spread soil on top of the seed. So as Megan mentioned earlier, we're just going to talk very briefly about weed control. And so the best control is prevention. You want to keep your grass as healthy as possible, because that's going to outcompete the weeds. If you get into a situation where you're having a lot of weeds, mechanical control is an option, hand pulling them before they flower or seed. Clallam County Noxious Weeds is an awesome local resource, and we do a weeds workshop every spring. We normally do them in person, but obviously that might not be happening this spring, so stay tuned. We will get you information. But I just wanted to quickly throw out the 3 most common, also toxic weeds that we routinely see. The first one being nightshade. I have seen a lot of nightshade this year. It's been a bad nightshade year, but I feel like I've said that the last 3 years, so I guess it's been 3 years of bad nightshade. If you have a tomato or potato looking like plant that you did not plant, it loves sandy things like arenas, sacrifice areas, the borders of fencing, cropped fields, that is likely nightshade. We have several different varieties: hairy nightshade, black nightshade. All of it is toxic, and you should hand pull this and sack it up and put it in your garbage. This is toxic to all classes of livestock, so know your nightshades. The next one I wanted to talk about is tansy ragwort. This is a biennial plant. So the first year will be a little cute ruffle of leaves on the ground, and the second year it sends up its horribly ugly yellow stalk. This again is toxic. The best thing to do is to get it the first year. This requires you kind of being aware of what's growing out in your pasture. Put your boots on, go out and take a walk, especially in the spring. If you see this plant, try to get rid of it. Again, it's another one that's nasty and you don't want growing and spreading in your pastures. And finally, I just wanted to mention poison hemlock. There are areas of our county where we do have significant infestations of poison hemlock. This is one of the most poisonous plants in our country. It can be a small plant, like boot height, and it also can be over your head, 6 feet tall. So it kind of just depends on the growing conditions. There are some common lookalikes. I even get stumped up occasionally with burr chervil, which looks a lot like poison hemlock. Poison hemlock is smooth. It does not have little hairs on the stem. It has purple splotches. You want to wear gloves when you're pulling this out, and the best thing to do is to pull it out. Again, put it in a trash bag, tie it up, and put it in your garbage can or take it to the landfill. So finally, renovating your pasture. So you've gone through all the work, you've planted your fields, it's springtime, and you're ready to go out there and graze it. But is your grass ready to be grazed? So you want to use the pull test, which basically you're just going to bend over, grab a handful of grass, and give a tug. And if you can tug that grass plant out by its roots, it is not ready to be grazed. So you need to be extra careful with these newly planted or renovated pastures. And so it may be that you end up just mowing them next grazing season or lightly grazing them. But again, they're like babies, so you need to treat them with tender, loving care. So I mentioned a little bit about local resources. You can get fertilizer, lime, and grass seed at the following Local stores, if we've left any out, I apologize. Let us know. This is kind of to the best of our knowledge. We're not going to promote one business over another. All of these are excellent. Go in, ask questions, give Megan and I a call. But basically, in summary, you know, like Megan said, you do not want to overgraze your pastures. It's one of the worst things you can do. Do not apply fertilizer too late into the fall. Sometimes if you wait until October, November, you're going to run the risk of nitrogen running off, and you're also going to run the risk of kind of tricking those plants into thinking like, hey, let's go out and grow, and then they use up all those sugar storage that they need to overwinter. Like Megan said, now is a great time to go out, get a soil test. Now is a great time to replant a field if you've decided you need to do that. And now is also a great time to figure out what you're going to do with your livestock over the winter. So again, we will be emailing out these publications. The Managing Healthy Pastures was developed specifically for our soils and climate and situation in Clallam County. And then that pasture and hayland renovation guide for Western Washington is a great resource too. And that's where you'll find your tables with your seeding rate calculators. I know that was a lot of information very quickly. So I think, Megan, we have a few minutes to take some questions. And again, feel free to email us or follow up with us individually too if you have specific questions.
Great job, Jen. So there were a couple questions and I did answer them over in the chat box, the ones that had so far come in. One was regarding if there's seed sources for native grassland and prairies. And the suggestion that I gave was a source called Northwest Meadowscapes. It's actually a company that we purchase pollinator seed from, and he gives a talk once a year, typically for us on pollinator species, but they actually grow some great native grass seed there. So that would be a really wonderful starting point. And if they didn't have quite what you needed, there's definitely some other places in Washington. That's just one that I'm familiar with. Another question that we had was regarding red clover and horses. The answer that I gave, Jennifer, and feel free to let me know if you have some other thoughts on this, is that the red clover, it's typically not the actual plant itself that can cause problems for horses, but that there's a fungus that can be toxic. So depending on whether or not there's perfect conditions that can cause that fungus to be produced, that's when it can cause a problem for horses. That said, I haven't ever run across anyone that's had any problem with that in our area, but for the most part, people don't have a lot of red clover in a field other than just kind of a few patches here and there, kind of spread around with the grass plants. So that might be why we've never seen a problem versus someone who, you know, maybe in some of the areas in the United States have fields that are just solely clover. So did you have any thoughts on that, Jen?
Nope, that sounds great.
Okay. And then we have a question on a lot of dandelions in the pasture. Do you want to get that one, Jen?
Yeah, so dandelions are a broadleaf plant, and they're actually super nutritious. And I never am overly concerned when I see dandelion in there. The livestock will actually utilize those, especially cattle and sheep, and to some part horses. The caution I would say is that there is also a plant that looks very similar to dandelion, that is called cat's ear, and it has a wiry stem and a smaller flower. So a dandelion typically has a hollow stem, and this other plant will have a wiry stem that's not hollow. It's a little bit smaller. The leaves are hairy, whereas the dandelion leaves are smooth, and that plant is not desirable to have in pastures. And I see it a lot in kind of overgrazed, very low soil fertility, very poorly managed pastures. And so again, that would be one. I wouldn't worry about dandelion, but I would make sure what you actually have is dandelion. And if it's this other plant, then you would definitely want to look at trying to amend the soils and plant some other grasses to try to outcompete that cat's ear.
Okay, so it looks like that is the end of our questions. Thank you everyone for staying on a little bit later. We apologize for being done just a little longer. There's just so much to talk about with pastures that it's hard not to go a little bit over, so we apologize for that. And stay tuned. We have some great webinars coming up in October with planning for farms, both for chicken operations and just for farms in general, livestock and horse farms. So if you get our newsletter, the information for that should be going out tomorrow or Monday. So feel free to register for those. We'd love to see everyone again. And we will be emailing out the recorded version of the presentation to everyone, as well as the publications. So look for that email probably coming out on Monday to your inboxes. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. It was wonderful to have all of your great questions, and thank you also. I see some great comments in the chat box. Thank you for those as well. It's wonderful to have the feedback on these.
Awesome. Thanks. Have a good evening, everybody.
Thanks everybody. Bye-bye.